On a freezing night in December 1944, in a foxhole somewhere east of the Belgian town of Bastogne, an American sentry crawled back to relieve the man he had served beside for 3 weeks. They had shared rations. They had shared cigarettes. They had carried each other's gear when one of them could no longer stand. The sentry reached down in the dark, put a hand on his friend's shoulder, and shook him gently to wake him for guard duty. That was the last thing he ever did with that hand intact. The sleeping man came up out of the earth before his own eyes were open, and the knife that every infantryman kept within reach was already moving. By the time the screaming brought the rest of the squad scrambling, one American lay dying in the snow, killed not by a German, not by a shell, not by the cold, but by the man sleeping next to him. And the man who had done it sat shaking, fully awake now, with no memory of deciding anything at all. This was not a single tragedy. It was a pattern. Across Normandy, across the hedgerows, across the Ardennes, the same thing kept happening in the dark. Veterans coming home would say it almost in passing, the way men mention things they have stopped being surprised by. You never, ever touched a sleeping soldier to wake him. You called his name. You threw a clod of dirt. You stayed back because the man on the ground was not resting the way a civilian rests. He was unconscious from a kind of exhaustion most people will never feel. And somewhere underneath that exhaustion, a part of him was still on the line, still waiting for the enemy, still holding the trigger. Touch him, and that part answered first. It answered with violence, and it answered before he could stop it. So the United States Army did something that, to the soldiers of its enemy, would have sounded like madness. It issued the warning again and again through sergeants and through hard experience. Never wake a sleeping GI by touching him. Think about what that admission contains. The most lavishly supplied army in the history of the world, an army drowning in trucks and shells and canned food, was telling its own men to be afraid of one another in the dark. Not afraid of the Germans, afraid of the friend in the next hole. Afraid of the thing a tired man becomes when his body has been pushed past the place where the mind still rules it. A German officer, raised in a tradition that prized iron discipline above almost everything, would have struggled to understand. In his world, the soldier's body belonged to the order of command. A man slept when told, woke when told, and held himself rigid against his own weakness, because weakness was a failure of will. The idea that an army would formally protect a sleeping rifleman, would treat his startle reflex as a known and dangerous fact to be engineered around rather than punished out of him, ran against everything that culture believed. And yet that is exactly what the Americans did. They looked at the deadly thing in the foxhole, and they did not call it cowardice. They called it a problem to be solved. Here is the question this story answers, and it is stranger than the warning itself. Why did the American soldier, of all the soldiers in that war, get pushed to the edge of that reflex? He was the one with the dry socks and the hot coffee waiting somewhere behind the line. He was the one whose factories sent everything forward. How did the same nation that gave its men more than any army had ever received also leave them so wrung out, so starved of sleep, so wired to kill on contact, that command had to warn them away from each other's shoulders? The answer is not sentiment. The answer is a chain of cold, deliberate decisions stretching from a knife stamped out by the tens of thousands in a Connecticut factory to medical researchers measuring the exact point where a man stops functioning, to the procedures written into Army manuals about how, precisely, you were permitted to rouse a sleeping soldier without dying for it. The man in the foxhole was dangerous because the system had made him dangerous. And before we can understand the warning, we have to understand the weapon that was always lying beside him in the dark, ready in his hand before he was ready in his mind. In December of 1942, in a quiet room far from any battlefield, a civilian board of directors sat down to choose a knife. Not a general, not a frontline officer, a committee of businessmen attached to something called the Smaller War Plants Corporation. They were looking at two competing designs for a fighting blade, and the decision they made came down to a number that had nothing to do with how a man dies in the dark. One design was the Marine Corps utility knife. The other was a narrow dagger-like blade meant for one thing and one thing only. The committee chose the second, and the reason they chose it was cost. It was cheaper to make. It used less strategic steel. And so, on the strength of a budget line, the United States Army approved the weapon that would end up lying in the hand of every exhausted rifleman who came up swinging in his sleep. They called it the M3 trench knife. It went into service in March of 1943, and the Catalog of Standard Ordnance described its purpose in a single flat sentence. It had been developed to fill the need in modern warfare for hand-to-hand fighting. There was no poetry in that. It was a tool with a job. The blade ran about 6 3/4 inches, spear-pointed, made of carbon steel, blued or parkerized so it would not catch the light. The grip was built from stacked leather washers turned smooth on a lathe. The whole thing weighed roughly 230 grams, light enough to vanish into a boot, light enough that a man's hand could close on it without thought. Now here is the part that turns a knife into a phenomenon. The Americans did not make a few thousand of these. Make a TA between March of 1943 and the late summer of 1944, in a window of barely 16 months, American factories produced more than 2.5 million cubic meters trench knives. 2.5 million. 9 separate cutlery companies were pulled into the work, and the names read like a map of small-town industrial America. The Imperial Knife Company of Providence, Rhode Island, stamped out more than 850,000 of them on its own. Utica Cutlery of New York made over 650,000. Camillus, in the New York town of the same name, made more than 400,000. Case, Pal, Kinfolks, Robeson, Boker, Ariel. Each blade was marked, first on the steel itself, and later on the crossguard, with the maker's name and the year. A German pulling one from a dead American's hand would have read those marks and understood nothing of what they meant. To him, it was a knife. To the country that made it, it was a line on a production schedule, one of millions, no more remarkable than a helmet or a canteen. That ordinariness is the whole point. The German army issued fine fighting knives too, but it issued them the way a careful country rations something scarce. The Americans issued the M3 the way a factory ships a product. By 1944, there were enough of them to arm the entire force. The blade went first to the men most likely to need it up close: the airborne troopers and the rangers, the paratroopers who strapped it along their boots so it could be drawn the instant they hit the ground. Then it went to everyone else: the tank crews, the machine gunners, the men carrying carbines who had no bayonet of their own. The submachine gun those soldiers often carried was so crude and cheap, it was nicknamed the grease gun. The knife beside it came from the same philosophy: make it simple, make it deadly, make a flood of it. The Germans, who tended to think of the American soldier as a creature of trucks and supply depots and overwhelming material, did not always credit him with the close, brutal competence of the knife. That was a mistake. The British noticed first. The British SAS, who had their own famous commando dagger, quietly set it aside and adopted the American M3 because it was sturdier in the hand. The men who fought at the closest range, where reputation means nothing and only the tool matters, reached for the American blade. And so, every night, in every hole along the line, the exhausted Americans slept with that mass-produced edge inside arm's reach. The factory had done its work. The weapon was there, in the dark, faster than thought. All that remained was the question of what would make a man use it on the friend who shook his shoulder. The answer was not in the steel. The answer was in how little that man had slept. Here's a sentence that an American military psychiatrist wrote down in 1946 after the war was over and the data had been gathered. There is no such thing as getting used to combat. He did not mean it as comfort. He meant it as a measurement. He and his colleagues had studied thousands of men, and they had found something the German army's culture of iron will refuse to accept. Every soldier, no matter how brave, no matter how well trained, no matter how many battles he had already survived, had a breaking point. It could be delayed. It could not be removed. And the thing that drove a man toward that point fastest was not fear and not blood and not the enemy. It was the simple, grinding loss of sleep. This is the strange heart of the whole story. The American soldier in 1944 was, by every material measure, the most fortunate fighting man on earth. His country shipped him an ocean of supplies. He had the rations, the medical care, the firepower, the trucks. And yet the same war that gave him all of that took from him the one thing no factory in Detroit could manufacture and load onto a ship. It could not send him sleep. On the line, a man might go 2 days, 3 days, 4 days without it. He fought through the dark because the enemy attacked in the dark. He stood watch because the watch had to be stood. He lay in a wet hole with the cold in his bones and his heart still hammering from the last shelling, and his body simply would not let go of consciousness because some ancient part of it understood that to sleep deeply here was to die. The army began to see what this was doing. After the disaster at Kasserine Pass in early 1943, a flood of broken men came back from the front, men who could not stop shaking, who stared at nothing, who had stopped functioning entirely. An army neurologist named Frederick Hansen was handed the problem, and he made a decision that quietly changed how the whole American military understood its own soldiers. He looked at these men and refused to call them cowards or call them mad. He insisted they be labeled with a single deliberate word: exhaustion. It was not a euphemism, it was a diagnosis. Hansen had found that a great many of these cases were nothing more than men who had been driven past the limits of human endurance by days of fighting without sleep. His treatment matched the diagnosis. He did not lecture them about will. He gave them a bed behind the lines, a meal and sedation, and a remarkable number of them, allowed to finally sleep, came back to themselves. Think about what that admission meant. The United States Army had concluded, in the middle of the largest war in history, that sleeplessness was not a moral failing to be punished, but a physical wound to be treated. We can put numbers on it now in a way they could only sense then. Modern Army research has found that a soldier running on just 4 hours of sleep a night can lose up to 85% of his combat effectiveness. Running on 5 or 6 hours, night after night, leaves a man performing as if he were legally drunk. The body kept awake long enough does not merely grow tired. It stops clearing the very waste from the brain that sleep is meant to wash away. The machine of the mind, denied its maintenance, begins to fail in ways the man himself cannot feel and cannot control. And this is where the friend in the foxhole becomes deadly. A man pushed that far does not sleep like a civilian in a warm bed. He drops into something deeper and more primitive, and underneath it, his nervous system stays locked on the threat that put him there. His reaction time to a real decision collapses, but his reflex to a sudden touch sharpens into something instant and merciless. The thinking part of him, the part that would recognize a friend, has been starved into silence. What remains is the part that kills first. The Germans, watching the Americans, could not read the logic of the pressure that produced these men. They saw an enemy of overwhelming supply and could not understand why that enemy fought with such a wired, dangerous edge. The answer was that the Americans understood exactly what sleeplessness was worth. They had measured it. They had treated it. They knew its price. And because they knew it, command was about to do something no army built on raw discipline would ever have thought to write down: a rule about how, precisely, you were allowed to touch a sleeping man. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, as American paratroopers drifted down into the black fields of Normandy, scattered miles from where they were supposed to land, they faced a problem with no good answer. A figure moving toward you in the dark could be a friend from your own stick or an enemy waiting to kill you. There was no time to argue and no light to see by. So the army had given them a system, and it was a small masterpiece of cold thinking. The challenge was a single word: flash. The correct reply was another single word: thunder. And there was a reason those exact words had been chosen out of all the words in the language. The reply contained a sound, the soft th at the front of thunder, that simply does not exist in spoken German. An enemy could learn the word. He could not easily say it. The wrong shape of a single syllable in the dark was enough to mark a man as the enemy. This was how the American army thought about the deadly confusion of the night. Not with hope, with procedure. That same cold thinking is the key to the warning at the center of this story. The United States Army did not leave the problem of the sleeping soldier to instinct or to luck. It understood, from medical men like Hansen and from the hard accounting of its own casualties, that an exhausted rifleman was a loaded weapon, and that the trigger was physical contact. And an army that will engineer a password around a sound a German cannot pronounce is an army that will absolutely engineer a procedure around a reflex that gets its own men killed. So the rule was passed down, sergeant to private, veteran to replacement, until it became one of the first things a new man learned when he reached the line. You do not walk up to a sleeping soldier and shake him. Ever. What you did instead was a kind of ritual, and every step of it was designed around the same principle that had chosen the word thunder. You kept your distance. The whole danger lived in the reach of a man's arm, so you stayed outside it. You used his name, spoken low but clear, because a name was something the deepest part of the mind still recognized as belonging to the world of friends, not threats. If his name did not pull him up, you spoke again. If you had to make contact at all, you did not lean in over him where a knife or a fist would find you first. You reached from beyond his reach. Some men learned to wake a comrade by pressing on a boot, on the very end of him, as far from his hands as the body allows, so that when he came up swinging, there was a body length of distance between the blow and the man who had woken him. This is the part that the soldiers of a discipline-obsessed enemy would have found almost impossible to credit. In their tradition, the soldier's body was the property of the order of command. A man who lashed out at the touch of a superior would be punished for it. The failing was his. The American army looked at the identical human reflex and drew the opposite conclusion. It did not try to discipline the reflex out of the man because it had already concluded in writing that the reflex could not be removed from a man pushed past his limit. So instead of changing the soldier, it changed the procedure for approaching him. It treated the killing reflex the way an engineer treats a hazard he cannot eliminate. He does not pretend it is gone. He builds the system so that no one stands in front of it when it fires. There is a quiet genius in that choice, and it runs through everything the American war machine did. The same instinct that mass-produced a knife by the millions, that measured the exact hour a man's mind begins to fail without sleep, that picked a password by the sounds a German throat cannot make, also wrote the unwritten law of the foxhole. Call his name. Keep your distance. Touch the boot, never the shoulder. It was not sentiment. It was not softness. It was the recognition that the most dangerous thing on that battlefield in the dead hours of the night was not always the enemy across the line. Sometimes it was the man you trusted most, asleep an arm's length away, with a blade in reach and the thinking part of him gone. And the army had decided that no soldier should die that way for the sake of a shaken shoulder, when a single spoken word from a safe distance would do the same job and let both men see the morning. When the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, the man who had commanded the armies that won it carried something home that did not fit in any duffel bag. Dwight Eisenhower had seen, up close and for years, what the loss of sleep did to soldiers. He had watched good men break, not from wounds, but from exhaustion, and he had understood that this was not a weakness of character, but a fact of the human body under fire. And so, after the guns fell silent, he did something that tells you everything about how the American system had learned to think. He directed the Army's own medical researchers to study sleep deprivation, to measure it, to find ways to blunt it. The institution that would carry that work forward, the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, became home to a sleep research center that exists to this very day. A general came back from the largest war in history, and one of the things he wanted understood was rest. Not a new gun, not a new tank, the exact cost of a sleepless soldier. That is the thread that ties this whole strange story together. The warning never to wake a sleeping G. 1. By touching him was not a curiosity. It was the visible tip of an entire way of seeing a soldier. The German military tradition, at its proudest, treated the individual man as something to be hardened, drilled, and bent to the will of the order above him. The breaking point was his shame to hide. The American approach, built less on philosophy than on factories and accountants and doctors, arrived somewhere very different. It came to see the soldier as a thing of immense value and limited supply, an asset that had to be maintained as carefully as any machine in the inventory. You did not waste him. You did not break him for no reason. And you certainly did not let him die in his own foxhole at the hand of the friend beside him for the sake of a shaken shoulder. Look at what that single rule sat on top of. It sat on a knife stamped out more than 2.5 million times by 9 companies in small American towns so that every exhausted man had a blade within reach in the dark. It sat on the work of an army doctor who, after Kasserine, refused to call broken men cowards and insisted on the word exhaustion and on the report that stated plainly that no soldier ever truly gets used to combat. It sat on the same institutional habit that chose a password by a sound a German cannot pronounce. Each of these was a separate solution to a separate problem, and together they formed a single picture. An army that treated the human being as an engineering problem worth solving, down to the moment of waking him. It would be a lie to pretend this is the reason the war was won. It was not. The defeat of that enemy was the work of many nations and an almost unimaginable shared sacrifice. The Soviet Union bled on a scale that dwarfs easy description, absorbing losses that no number on a page can hold. Britain endured alone when there was little reason to hope. The victory belonged to all of them, and to the millions who did not come home to any country. What the story of the sleeping soldier shows is something narrower and, in its own way, just as telling. It shows how one nation, asked to fight the finest soldiers in the world, chose to answer not by claiming its men were braver or harder, but by treating their fear, their exhaustion, and even their deadly reflexes as problems with practical solutions. And so we end where we began, in a foxhole in the dark, with one man asleep and another who needs to wake him. But now you know what that simple moment contains. You know about the blade lying within reach, mass produced by a country that armed even the sleep of its soldiers. You know about the days without rest that hollowed a man out until the thinking part of him went silent, and only the killing part remained. You know why the man approaching does not reach for the shoulder. He stops at a careful distance, just beyond the reach of an arm. He does not lean in. He does not touch. He speaks the sleeping man's name, low and clear, into the cold, and he waits. Behind that small and careful act stands the whole weight of a nation that had done the math, counted the cost, and decided that a soldier's life was too valuable to spend on a careless hand in the dark. The man on the ground stirs. He opens his eyes, and because no one touched him, both of them live to see the morning.